We're very pleased today to have Zhenhua Chen come talk to us. Zhenhua is one of ours. He has a PhD in public policy from George Mason University. And then after that, he spent some time at the Creative Center at the University of Southern California. And Zhenhua's research focuses on economic resilience and transportation and infrastructure. You know, I was thinking walking down, we're having some work being done in the building right now. A really good anecdote and example of resilience. And so I had to go across the building and take an alternative route. But today you're going to be talking a little bit about equity and so if I were not able-bodied and not able to take the stairs and was reliant on the elevator and the elevator were closed, I wouldn't have a good alternative, but I had two good alternatives left to get down the stairs. So Zhenhua thinks about things like this and transportation planning, and I'll leave it to him to introduce his talk a little bit more. He's an economist in training. So does that mean you like to be interrupted when you're talking, or would you prefer to keep quiet?
Well, you know, that's a great question. So, well, first of all, thank you, Rob, for the great introduction, and thank you, Stephanie, for inviting me to be here. And I was talking with Rebecca earlier. Yeah, it's always feel like coming to your home. You know, when I every time go to the policy school. Because my background, my training is public policy, but now I'm working in the city and regional planning. So this really tells you, you know, my work, my background basically is really focused on this kind of interdisciplinary perspective. Before I get into the talk, I would like to briefly just tell you a little bit about myself. So my research mainly focused on infrastructure's planning and policy. I look into regional economic impacts of transportation. For example, their investment and impacts. And also doing impact analysis of disasters, look into resilience perspective. For example, how does hurricanes, also like COVID and any kind of disruptive events affecting our critical infrastructure system. All of these research are obviously focused on one of the important policies outcome, which is how could we really allocate our funding sources in a more effective and equitable ways to help our cities, communities be more resilient for the future strikes, right? So that's the big kind of background of my work. So today, I'd like to really share with you a kind of study I have been working with two of my brilliant PhD students. We have been working on this for almost 2 years, and Stephen and I have been chatting about this because we're focusing on equity. As we have heard now, there is a huge change in the federal government in terms of the focus on a lot of the policies. So this paper is basically almost coming out. It's already in the second revised, we submitted it. So there will be obviously no changes in terms of the title, but yes, definitely we're working on some additional updates, which is more focused on some other aspects. Certainly, we can have more broader discussions to the end. If you have any, questions, particularly lengthy questions, and we can discuss that. But if you have any clarification questions and not clear, feel free to raise up your hand and we can get that clarified. Okay. All right. So now the topics here, as I said, it's called improving the community resilience through the equitable infrastructure investment. Now, here the biggest background here, I wanted to mention two things. So first of all, infrastructure. And second is AI, particularly in the decision making. Now, infrastructure, obviously, we have all know that it's been critical for economic growth and connectivity and the community resilience. As we have known that the U.S. used to be pioneers in terms of infrastructure system, especially if you look into the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s. But if you look into right now, we have a lot of infrastructure problems. Bridges as being too old, the roads in lack of maintenance, and not to mention about other advanced modes of transportation, such as high-speed rail and so on. So that's really an indication that a lot of the community and cities actually really suffers from the lack of sufficient infrastructure investment. Now, the other things to look into is really there has been a lot of the debates, obviously, we know when we talk about infrastructure investment, simply because there's a lot of the political, influences on the decision making, and also has been consideration about how should we allocate the funds, in what ways, right? So I will talk about that more specifically. You will see that, well, as we change the way how we reallocate the funding sources, the outcome can be quite different. Now, the other big context I want to talk about is obviously AI. We have been living in the AI year, and there is every day there's some news about AI, how advanced this is, and how should we really adopt this for our policies, decision making, for our studies, and so on. So obviously, we have been really consider AI as a tool, as a kind of assistant tool. How could this really help us to advance understanding about the data, helping us understand it about insights that we could draw from all of our empirical analysis, so that we can provide with more powerful or more insightful implications for the policy and planning decision. So definitely, this is the sort of like a big background of this kind of research, which is really trying to help you understand, well, how can we really use this kind of advanced so-called AI dominated or kind of assisted methodologies, helping us to understanding infrastructures and their impact. Now, talking things more specifically about this research, this is a study, as I mentioned, initially primarily after the passage of this bipartisan infrastructure law. Earlier, it was known as the Infrastructure Investment Job Act. That was one of the biggest, probably the world, they call it the largest infrastructure bill they passed, in the history in the U.S. So obviously, one of the major emphasis of that initiatives at that time was really how can we really not only to improve the sufficient amount of investment, but also how can we really improve the outcome of the equity. So obviously, there has been different discussions at that time. Well, how can this equities is being really enhanced? For example, maybe we should revisit about our funding allocation mechanism, maybe consideration, adding more consideration about, economically disadvantaged communities. Now, obviously, from a decision-making standpoint of view, obviously, there is really lack of empirical evidence and support, particularly helping us understand how, if we reallocate the fundings, in a different way, how this would affect the equity outcome. So how can we really measure that kind of outcome? Okay. But obviously, on another point, that you can also see that the previous administration also acknowledged the fact that there should be more data-driven and data-based, evidence-based decision-making for our public policy. Okay, so this is really, I guess, the biggest, I would say, maybe the start point for us to really start thinking about this issue. Now, the other important things to look into is also in terms of the specific funding allocation mechanisms of this BIL kind of bipartisan infrastructure law. And you can see that, well, this basically includes investment in all modes of transportation, and also it covers some additional infrastructure such as broadband and the water infrastructure and so on. Now, again, the question is, well, how should we allocate these, funding sources? Is this supposed to optimum, allocations formulas, how this would affect in the outcome of equities, particularly if we're looking into all different cities, considering their kind of social economic background. So how does that kind of affect in that? There's no really understanding of that. So the objective of this studies is really to hopefully provide with some empirical evaluations, understanding their social economic equalities, and as well as the allocation of infrastructure investment. Okay, so keep in mind, we're not only looking into, well, what is the role of infrastructure on this kind of socioeconomic outcome, but we're more looking into the allocation of these funding sources. So how this would affect in the outcome. Now, just to quickly, so we used some obviously data this famous data called the Social Vulnerability Index. I know many of you are also probably using this for your own studies and other kind of policy domain. But this is really data created by the Center of the Disease and Controls. It provides with a very detailed capturing about the community performances, particularly from the resilience and vulnerability standpoint, which I will talk about later on in more detail. But also we used the data at the local municipality level, particularly provided with a very detailed infrastructure expenditures. So we can know all these expenditures at the different infrastructure types. So that really allows us to do a more thorough investigation on questions such as spatial and temporal distribution of those inequalities among these, both the social vulnerability and infrastructure expenditures to see their kind of spatial temporal patterns, what that looks like. Also, it allows us to examine the statistical associations between these SVI changes and infrastructure expenditure. And last but not least, it also allows us to maybe doing some kind of examination about what will be the kind of potential impacts about the current, funding allocations schemes, particularly on this equity outcome. So to start with this kind of discussion, I guess, Joe is loving here when I look at these pictures here, but I guess, this is a picture probably everyone is familiar with, but just for your background, we have been talking a lot about equity as an equality, right? So what does that really mean? Well, if you look into this here, basically the literature really suggests there's two types of ways how we look into this issue, okay? Number one is we look into what we call the horizontal equity. Now, what this means is that people's needs be treated equally, regardless of their socioeconomic status. Just thinking about the situation like here. So basically, all these different, let's say, cities or individuals will receive the equal amount of the distribution. And that's the easiest way of how we understand this type of allocation scheme. Now, strictly speaking, this is really called the equality because this really indicates while each individuals or communities receive the same amount of this distribution based on certain formula. Now, on the other hand, there is another term called the vertical equity. Now, if you see the vertical equities, it really refers to something related to social justice because disadvantaged groups generally are considered to receive a greater share of resources, okay? So based on this kind of distribution, you can definitely see more focuses will be on those lower socioeconomically, groups. So for example, if you look into the picture here, so that basically illustrating the fact that if the communities are relatively poor in some way, they should relatively receive a higher portion of the resources. And obviously, based on this kind of background, we started to do some kind of literature review, really trying to understand, what is our current knowledge about these examinations, both about equity evaluation as well as examining their infrastructure's impacts. So this is really just a quick summaries about some of the studies we find out from the field of transportations. Now, in general, just to quickly summarizing some of the things here. We find out that these studies obviously has tried to focus on, for example, equity discussion, but mainly looking into using indicators like accessibility. This is actually classical approaches in the field of transportation system when scholars just tend to examining the inferences of equity. They look into the spatial equity, look into accessibility, how this accessibility to different locations varies spatially. Secondly, we also find out that, although there has been some studies that's focused on the equality measured as the different groups, their methodologies typically are what we consider as more like a descriptive, in a sense that they primarily rely on certain indicators. As we know, those including like Gini coefficients, theory indexes, and just trying to illustrate the fact that how these distributions of their outcomes varies. So that means that there's really lack of kind of in-depth of investigations, particularly look into how kind of infrastructures, investment has been correlated, really affecting these kind of equity outcomes. Also, as we can see that there is definitely more, particularly a couple of years ago, right, at the former, president administration, there has been a lot of emphasis on, well, how should we really thinking about allocations of our fundings toward not only about efficiency, but more for the, equity outcome. So this is why, again, there's really hasn't been a lot of focuses on how can we really quantify that. Just also for your background. Now, what is the current, funding allocation mechanisms here in the U.S.? Just to quickly give you some background, well, if you look into the kind of federal government guideline, well, there is two major consideration procedures for these funding allocations. It is basically known as a combination of formula-based funding and competitive grant programs. Now, obviously, the formula-based funding is simple and basically based on the certain formula. The formula is mainly based usually on the populations, the size of the populations. So, which means, different states will get relatively equal shares of the funding. So you will see. Now, the second one is what obviously we know as a competitive grant. So this is obviously more being applied to different federal and state, grants is really based on the competitions. Now, so what we're here again trying to really address, let's see here. Yeah, so in this study, as you can see, because we have seen that there's really lack of that kind of methodologies and frameworks to allow us to thoroughly, hopefully evaluating the role of infrastructure allocation and the equity outcome. We hope we could, using this works, at least to provide frameworks that could eventually be further improved and be applied maybe for planning and decision. Now, secondly, also, we are more looking into not into the past, simply because a lot of the study, obviously, we know it's called the ex post analysis, but obviously thinking about the futures, we're more interested in looking into, well, what is the predictabilities of these type of analysis? How accurate these type of analysis could provide with us some kind of results that could help us to do a better, decision making. So this is how we actually consider ourselves as in terms of the contribution of this work. Many it really helps us to improve our understanding about this infrastructures, their impact on the community resilience, but also look into, well, developing the frameworks that could eventually have predicted powers for the future, impact evaluation. All right. Now, to start with this kind of detailed discussion of the frameworks, let me first introduce to you, well, how do we really measure community resilience, right? So I know resilience is a buzzword, and Professor Greenbaum has mentioned about resilience earlier, from his vivid personal experiences. Now, for the definition, community resilience has generally been defined as the community's abilities to withstand and be able to adapt and bounce back from a disruptive events, right? So these disruptive events could be natural disasters, could be man-made disaster or technological system failure, and so on. So there has been extensive studies looking into community resilience, looking into different indicators, how that could measure community resilience. Now, in this particular study, obviously, we are using this kind of generic definition of community resilience, but we're more focused on how using this social vulnerability index, right, as an indicator to measure, well, the community's kind of resilience performances. Just to give you also a quick background, the FEMA actually has developed a website based on this social vulnerability index to measure these kind of community, resilience level. Again, that has been primarily used, again, for the state and local emergency management agencies to understand the potential impacts of disasters on different communities. Now, for this particular study, one of the key things that we need to do is, we needed to identify, appropriate indicators to really measure these equity outcomes. Now, this is the indicators that we come up with because we feel it has a few advantages. Number one, it actually provides with comprehensive coverage about the community's general performances, social economic performance. That's what I mean here. So you can see it includes the social economic status, also the disabilities, minority groups, and so on. Now, one of the challenges, if if you're working on this data, is that if you visit the website, you only see that the data is available at a certain time period because the data hasn't been updated very often. However, it does provide a methodology. So what we did was basically, in order to get a longer time period of data to obtain a more robust analysis, we actually used their methodology frameworks, and based on the census and American Community Survey, and developed the studies so that we can basically develop all these data for the different years from 2010 to 2019. So just to quickly give you some overview about this, I know this is a very busy and hard to read diagram, and you probably couldn't really tell something here. Let me just to quickly tell you, well, this is really just tells you the ranking of all the cities. You can consider different cities in the US in terms of their vulnerability performances. This is a time period in the 2010, and this is the period of 2019. The overall pictures, what it shows to you is, well, the vulnerability performance of these cities are actually changing. Some cities are actually very flat, meaning that there's not much changes. Their social vulnerability performances are generally constant, such as the Hartford or so on. However, we do note that some cities actually there's a huge changes. Their rankings, for example, has been substantially improved, such as cities like Boston's, also like Albany's and so on. So they have been generally on the increasing trend. On the other hand, we also find that some cities, their trend has been actually become worse, meaning that the ranking of the social vulnerability performances is actually deteriorating. So those would including, for example, cities like the Concord, and there's also some other cities here we can generally see. So basically, you can see it's actually improved. Now, I guess what does this really tells us? Well, this just tells us the fact about, well, the social economic performances actually changes over time. But again, we do not know how much of these changes is associated or related to the infrastructure quality, and particularly how the allocations of the state and local government finance, I mean, their investment, right? So in the infrastructure, how this affecting their performances. So this is something we would love to explore a little bit further. So the next thing we did was we started looking into the state and local government finance, and to see particularly in terms of their allocation, well, among different modes of transportation, how are they really performing? So this one you can see, again, we calculate these infrastructure. Again, this is infrastructure investment in the health sectors, housings, water, sewage, and transportation. Just to clarify, again, this is really mainly focused on the capitals, expenditures. So you can generally get the sense, by even using these 3 different indicators, we can generally find a consistent pattern. For example, we can find out that, well, the water and sewage system, in terms of their basically infrastructures expenditures, has generally become more inequitable. But in terms of the health outcome, well, you can see that's generally becomes more equitable. So basically, the number has become negative, which means their Gini coefficients is decreasing. Decreasing means that it's become more equitable. So at least you can get some sense. Well, in general, the infrastructures and investments into these different sectors are actually pretty much changing in the kind of consistent patterns here. Now, what's next? Well, one of the biggest challenges for this kind of research is obviously how can we really develop reliable or robust methodologies so that we can use this for data analytics. Now, obviously, we used a kind of approaches called the deep learning methodologies, and we also used some additional methods, particularly called the social, clustering methodologies, to really understanding, well, how can we really systematically knowing these kind of communities variation differences here. So there are, generally speaking, 3 steps we did. The first of all, we needed to understand how can we really classify all these communities, in our case, different cities. Well, which groups they belong to? Are they considered as more social, economically vulnerable groups, or are they considered as a more economically advantaged groups? Also, we needed to know well, how can we really establish this kind of relationship? Now, obviously, the advantages of using this kind of machine learning-based approach is that, well, it allows us to really capture more complex relationships because some of the relationship may not be linear as we normally based on, regression, OLS, and so on. Some of the relationship could be nonlinear. So by using this type of modeling, it allows us to capture that kind of nonlinearity. More importantly, we can use these frameworks to do some kind of testing and just to see, well, how can we, using this and to get some maybe understanding, particularly how these allocation scheme varies, how this associated with the change of the socioeconomic outcome. All right, so I know this is a little bit more technical, so I will be quick. Again, this is just trying to show you, well, how can we really classify all these sectors? Different communities, different cities in different groups. As I said, the general approach is here is called this self-organizing mapping. Basically, it's based on the different characteristics of the cities. So they're trying to group in them based on the certain rates. So we will be able to classify them in a more systematic ways, and so that we'll be able to know, well, which cities are actually more similar in terms of their social economic performances. So this is just a quick example to give it to you in terms of, well, cities considered as the most kind of disadvantaged versus the cities considered as the most advantages. Again, this advantages versus the disadvantages are purely based on their social economic, vulnerability index outcome. Okay, so it's a kind of overarching kind of reflections about their overall performance. Now, so in terms of this kind of again deep learning analysis, obviously it's based on more complicated algorithm behind that, but similar to kind of our statistical modeling, we needed to hopefully improve the analysis, hopefully by considering the effects of other important factors, such as maybe policies, maybe some other, characteristics. So in this analysis, as you can see that we're using the social vulnerability index as the dependent variable. The independent variable including not only about these different infrastructure investment or expenditures in its different categories, subject matters, but we also included things like the policies domain variable. Particularly, if you look in here, we know that there are certain important policies that would affect their socioeconomic outcome. I know we have a lot of experts in the room, and so we'll have a more discussion later on. So you can see we included the things like regional economic status, populations, density, social equity policies. Those are the policies, again, that has been discussed, and that would have influences on social vulnerability performances. This was actually based on the studies that which has conducted a more thorough evaluations about their outcomes. So those including policies both in the transportation domain, public health and nutrition domains, natural resources conservation domain, and housing domain. So by including all of these, again, we are basically allowing the systems just to really helping us to find out the most, reliable of estimation of outcome. Now, sort of the kind of technical background here is, again, we used some deep learning approaches, which is primarily based on recurrent neural networks. This is the kind of approaches particularly useful for, kind of panel data, particularly with the sequential information. So that would allows us to improve the estimation outcome. So how can we really base on this kind of complex framework, right, to really help us understanding the simple question that is, well, how do we change the funding allocation scheme? Well, what kind of a socioeconomic outcome will become, right? So here we needed to develop some kind of scenarios so that to make that kind of investigation. Now here we have let's say, considering two, simple approaches. One is what we call equality-focused approaches, which means we assuming the funding is being allocated equally. So different cities, just based on their population, based on their existing formula, they receive a certain amount of infrastructure investment in those different sectors. So this is one way of the allocation. Now, alternative ways of allocating these funds is we can say, well, wait a minute, maybe we should consider allocating more fundings toward those economically disadvantaged cities. So, but how much, right? Should we allocate it maybe, 10%, 20%, or 30% from those advantaged communities to disadvantaged communities or not, right? So we don't know that yet. But basically, this is called the equities-focused approach. So in this case, for example, if we, assuming, right, we allocated, 30% of those investment, which used to be allocated for these advantaged communities, but now we are changing them to this disadvantaged communities. Well, what are their outcomes? So that's the kind of a simple way how you can think about this strategy scenario here. So based on this kind of scheme, right, so we can basically test, well, for the different portions of this transfer or the shift of allocations, we can see what the social economic outcomes looks like. So based on this frameworks, we could basically also test the existing funding allocation scheme for this bipartisan infrastructure law sort of allocation scheme to look into, well, what is the kind of association? Now, this is really just a quick summary, just tell you, well, now, if we, based on this methodologies, we can basically see that, well, annually, there is roughly about 41 billion of funds being allocated among these almost 400 cities. Now, based on the 2019, we can roughly see that this is, roughly speaking, will get us an average predicted social vulnerability index of the 6.439, whatever it is. But you can see if we try to allocate the funding according to this IIJA's formula. Now, obviously, depending on whether it's equality focus or versus equity focus, we do see there is a different outcomes of their social vulnerability index overall. Now, particularly specifically speaking, you could see that, well, if we are using this equality focused approach, this means that by allocating based on the existing formula of funding allocation, this would need to compare it to the base cases. It would need to probably 0.12% decrease of the social vulnerability index, which means that the overall performance is going to be improved slightly. Now, if we based on this equity-based approach, what you will see is that, well, this social vulnerability outcome for all these cities as an average will actually be improved much further because there's a decrease of 0.45%. So based on this kind of rationale, we could try to make the story simple by using this illustration here. So basically, we could using, for example, this kind of equality-based as this kind of base case, and we try to calculate this kind of differences based on these different, equity-based approaches. So if you see here, so higher the gap, which means that there is obviously a larger kind of changes as you're moving from the equality-based approaches to the equity-based approaches. Now, so we did this again for all these different cases. Now we're doing this incremental. So you can see from this diagram here, it's really illustrating, well, what is the kind of changes as you try to move the fundings from, let's say, advantaged communities to disadvantaged communities at the 10% incremental. So on the left-hand side, this is really, we could consider as the existing funding allocations scheme, which is again based on the formula-based equality approaches. So you would see that this would only needs to probably 0.12% of decreasing of those overall kind of social vulnerability performance. As we improve this portion, you can see as we improve, let's say for 20%, 30%, and you can see the decrease is going to be obviously be starting to become higher. So this really tells us as we're allocating more fundings from, let's say, those advantaged, economic advantaged cities to those economically disadvantaged cities, we would see that the overall social vulnerability performances is actually going to be increased. That means the index is going to be decreased more. But obviously, you could see that one could say that, well, what if you, let's say, transfer, an extreme case, all these funds from the advantaged communities to disadvantaged community, right? What would be the outcome looks like? Well, here it gives you the answers. Now you can definitely see, certainly it's going to improve, but the improvement will be not to be linear or will be not be overly higher. So in other words, so you can see on the extreme cases, there's only going to be 45% decrease if you allocate all these funds from the advantaged community to disadvantaged community, right? Obviously, that's not possible. So this is what this really tells you is that you could see there is actually a marginal effect, which means from the policymaking standpoint of view, right? So obviously, there's a lot of discussion in terms of how much portion you have to allocate it. There's a lot of political also inferences as well. But at least this study tells you that if you if from the policymaking standpoint of view, I mean, you could allocate about 10 to 30% of those funds from those economically relatively advanced communities to these less economic advantage to community, well, you would generally see a generally higher portions of improvement overall. But as you further improve that, see it's pretty much stable, so that really doesn't change too much. All right, so what does this study really tell us? Again, this is a very preliminary study. This study confirms that, well, certainly there is a kind of a relationship between the infrastructures expenditures and this community's performances measured by the social vulnerability index. Also, as we can see that generally, if you improve the infrastructure investment, you would expect a decrease of the social vulnerability index. But we also see that the way how you allocate these funds among these different cities would also change this kind of social vulnerability index as well. Now, generally speaking, we find out as we have more fundings being allocated to more economically disadvantaged communities. In other words, if we are more focused on this equity centralized approaches of funding allocation, we would expect that there is going to be a more improvement overall. Now, last but not least, this study definitely also, we believe, would provide with some kind of new frameworks, particularly thinking about how can we really use this new methodology data analytics to help us to guide it for future decision making. All right, now this is the fun part. This is all the discussion about equity, as we have discussed again, like I said, this study has been done, for the past 2 years, which is under the previous administration. We have seen that there's a huge change at the federal government, and now all these policies has been changed from equities to efficiency. So what's the implication of this kind of studies, right? So under the new, scheme, and more importantly, how can we still consider this kind of directions of this kind of research, and how can we really help us to understand the decision making for critical infrastructures investment? Well, here is my limited thoughts, but I'm open the floor for discussion. Well, certainly, as you can see, under the different, political, context, there is definitely different focuses. But no matter what, the efficiencies and equities are both important considerations, particularly, depending on, obviously the angles we're looking at. Traditionally, infrastructure investment has always been focused on efficiency. If you look into World Banks, look into, other state agencies, all of those investment is based on the BCA, the return, to investment sort of ratio. Again, that's the efficiency-based metric. What we are highlighting is the fact that, well, efficiency is not the only, should not be considered as the only solution, right? So equities is certainly an important consideration as well. So what we believe, again, this type of methodologies allows us is, it allows us to really provide with more formal investigations. Perhaps not only looking into the equities, but we can also look into adding the efficiencies. Or maybe we could develop some kind of aggregated index in the future, maybe considering both the equities and efficiency in some way, and see that trade-offs, how that outcomes will be different. So hopefully this type of analysis will provide, again, our, particularly government agencies with some kind of implementable tools so that they can, better assist them for their decision making. With that, I will simply conclude here. So thank you all for your attention and happy to discuss.
And I really like this idea of thinking about how infrastructure can shape and investments in infrastructure can shape social vulnerability. But so I've got lots of questions that I've kind of jotted down, but I think the big one is just, I'm wondering when I look at that social vulnerability index, so if you were to put up I don't know if you have that slide that has all the things in it.
Yes.
I'm just, so that's the outcome that you're training your model to optimize, or at least you're training your model to predict. You've got a score that emerges that is the dependent variable.
Right.
That is the score is a function of these things.
Right.
And you're using some sort of algorithmic process to come up with the function of these things to create that index.
Right.
And then you're predicting these things based on infrastructure investments, and maybe, I don't know if there's other controls in the model. But I'm wondering, some of these things don't seem to be changeable unless people move in or out of an area. So for example, the number age 17 or younger, or age 65 or older, or minority, some of those things. So like, I'm trying to think, usually when we think about, I want to think about I almost wonder if you're underestimating, because your effects are really pretty small. It's like less than 1% in infrastructure, but I wonder if it's because a lot of these things are actually not like probably going to change with unless a lot of mass population moves in and out.
Exactly.
And then there's going to be huge legs. And I don't know if this is being measured contemporaneously. Like then it's like you're not allowing for any of those legs to happen. So yeah, my mind is just rushing with all that stuff. Sorry.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. I mean, it's a really excellent question here. Well, let me clarify a few things first of all. Number one, this index actually has been developed again by the CDC. I mean, and again, you are absolutely right. There is a formula how they are based on all these metrics. It's came up with this kind of magic final score, right? So, and that has been again adopted by the federal agencies for a lot of the program evaluation. Now, certainly in this case, so these indicators, obviously, particularly like those social demographic structures, they're not changing. If you're looking into at the yearly based period of time. So, but if you're looking into like a 10 years or even longer time period, you will see there will be some changes, even though
it improves if people who are minorities move out.
Yes.
Or older people move out.
Yes.
That's not necessarily good.
Now, so you see, this is actually why we think this indicators will be relevant, particularly evaluating the transportation system or other infrastructure. And this is actually one of the reviewers that actually pointed out in terms of the how do you explain, right? So the relationship between that. Well, if you're thinking about some of the infrastructure investment, it does change some of our communities, formations. Especially when you have a better, let's say, roadway networks or transportation system. It facilitates people to migrate from one places to another. So that actually really helps this kind of structure changes. Also, if you're thinking about some other things, such as the education literacy, some, American households, they probably couldn't, send the kids to some good school because of the transportation or other kind of things are lacking. So there is some kind of.
But if those kids move into the neighborhood that can't speak English, your score is going to go down or be worse. Or if people who are minority are moving in, your score gets worse. So it improves if people move out.
So yes, so there is definitely the reason, particularly if you're looking into more specifically in terms of which communities, well, how their performances may differ, right? So, but I think for this studies, we're not examining at the community level. We're more looking at this whole societal level or at the national level. Now, also just to quickly respond to your earlier question, these numbers might look quite small, right? But keep in mind, this is only a measures of a year impact. And this is also looking into the whole states as an overall. So apparently, if you only look into a yearly impacts on that, even though you look into it's like a 0.4 or 0.3, that number even looks more, but it's looking to the societal impacts. It's not like just one community's, well, their performance is improving or not. So this is like what we are trying to making sure, well, like a Pareto's efficiency. See what I'm saying? So basically you're trying to really improve the overall performances, not just about a particular community.
So you're not just running the regression with each of the 345 cities in it and predicting the outcomes?
we're predicting we're using all of these samples, and then we're predicting this overall kind of average outcome, which is as a measures for overall. Apparently, we could look into each individual cities, but I didn't report it here.
Sorry.
I'm sorry. We can talk a little more, but
Were you measuring, so each city, what's the unit of analysis in the regression?
the unit of analysis is the city.
The unit of analysis
year.
is the city and year in a regression,
Yes.
okay? And then are you looking at, in that year and city, the dependent variable is their score in that year for this index?
Right.
And the independent variable is how much infrastructure investment was made in that year?
Well, we also considered about the lag effects, as you
Okay.
pointed out.
Yeah.
Okay, so there is a mechanisms to consider that as well.
All right, I'll stop when others ask.
That's great.
I love the question you're asking,
Well,
just
you-
trying to figure out the methods. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Push a little bit more on the
Please.
measures and maybe unintended consequences of the results. And you're a little better off in that you're looking at the municipal level, but if you're looking at the neighborhood level, you look at my work that Harvey Miller is doing, and you're looking at these ghost neighborhoods.
Right.
And the critique there is that the investments were actually made in the most vulnerable neighborhoods, because when I-70 was built through the center of Columbus, that maybe it's not a good thing that the infrastructure investments are going into the most vulnerable neighborhoods.
Right. Well, absolutely, yes. So I totally agree with you. I mean, if you're looking into a different geographic scale, I mean, this kind of results could be quite different. I mean, I have roughly heard about that ghost city projects, although I haven't know a lot of details here. But I think, again, the way how we are looking here is, again, this is really at the city level. Particularly if you're thinking about from the federal government agency standpoint, well, how should we really allocate these funds? Should we still allocate based on this formula-based approach, which means based on simply populations? Or should we should consider more weight or maybe allocating more funds to some other particular city? The other thing also you could notice that, they're based on kind of competitive sort of a grant, but not all these economically vulnerable communities are able to compete, through those grants. So obviously, if we are thinking about adding some new ways of funding allocation, what will be the procedures? How should we really thinking about, a better ways to improve this social economic outcome? So this methodology is really focused at the city level. So instead of at the neighborhood, but I agree with you. If you look into some infrastructure, look into the highway, so that may actually wipe out a whole, economic vulnerable community. So that may actually look like, while those communities have received a lot of investment, but their outcome is worse. But I think that will need to probably will have to use more complex, or maybe more advanced approaches like spatial econometrics analysis. Because I think in some of these neighborhood effects, again, there's kind of spillover effects. And also it depends on how you actually measure the investment. Is the investment really being considered as some of the funds improve certain things, benefit from the community or so on? So I agree with you, but that's really, I would say, needed to rethink about this kind of different scope of the data and how that, link into this explanation.
I was gonna say, to better compete, that students should all take the cross-listed class with city and regional planning on grant writing.
Thank you for the encouragement. Yes, well, it's always nice to have students in my resilience class, and so that's why we have a lot of discussion, very interesting discussion.
That's another question, please. In terms of the categorizing the cities, do you take into, I didn't see like the age of infrastructure or the municipal age?
The age of the infrastructure.
Yeah, or the age of the city. I assume there's.
Yes, so that's a great question. So we have only included the temporal effects again in this case, but we don't have the age of the city. So I guess that's a really interesting point. I guess what I'm trying to getting at. Are you thinking about the age when the city has been established? Something like that as a variable?
Existing infrastructure. Are their bridges really old, right?
Yeah, there's a road 2 blocks down from my house that's been closed for 3 years now because they're
Right.
updating the
Yeah.
sewage.
That's I think, a very, insightful thought. Well, I wish we could have that, but I feel that could be a little bit struggle, particularly this is really measured at the city level. So in that case, we may have to come up with some kind of average.
Average age of bridges in the city or.
Yeah,
average age
yeah.
of- Yeah,
Yeah, so maybe something like an average age of the city of the roads, I mean,
yeah.
that can be a way to do, but I have to think about that because the data could be an issue, because you probably wouldn't know, well, how old is the roads, or the bridges, and plus, and you may have to get involved with the weight. You know, are you gonna consider all these bridges, the same? I mean, obviously you have a large bridge and you have a smaller bridges, so they're obviously sometimes not comparable, especially if you consider about the traffic volumes and so on. So, I mean, it's a nice way of thinking, but I think data could be a challenge.
Is it not, I mean, I'm really naive, but is there like, for municipal planning purposes, do they not like have some evaluation of the city's like infrastructure? Like, I wonder if they do any kind of an I mean, you'd think they'd have to for planning and budgeting purposes.
Well, that's a good question. So, I can only speak about the transportation system. Well, from ODA standpoint of view, I mean, ODA has maintained the public roads, roadways.
Yeah.
And if this local roads, and obviously it's measured, is being maintained by the municipality, cities. Well, ODA does have some kind of vulnerability, kind of score about their infrastructures. So they're looking into, I mean, primarily using GIS.
Yeah.
So they're particularly surveying the road quality and so on, and so section by section. Now, obviously, if we are thinking about using that as a variable here, I think we need to think about, again, how to reach out to overall index. It's not obviously impossible, but definitely, I think it's a nice way of thinking. In fact, I think the American Civil Engineering Society actually ranks those kind of infrastructures, so that could be a way to look into. So.
Thanks for this presentation. I have some questions about community resilience, but I'll save
Okay.
those. I'm mostly interested in when one of your slides, it showed a number of really interesting cities, a lot of them in the southeast, and one of them I used to live in Montgomery, Alabama,
Okay.
and I was thinking all about kind of the infrastructure of that
Right.
place and the way that the city built this highway through a lot of predominantly black neighborhoods in the city. And I was wondering, was there any variation across like regions in your study as well?
Okay. The variations of the social economic performances, you mean among regions, right? Well, that's a really great question, I guess. Let me see if I can showing this. Guess maybe this is the one you're talking about, right?
There were several that showed kind of some of the cities, but maybe this slide is the one that can
Okay.
kind of help us.
Right, so, again, that's a good question. We do have pictures, well, it's actually in the paper. I didn't put it here, but I will make sure to share that with you. We did include maps which show you, how their social vulnerability index actually changes. And you could actually see there is some interesting patterns. So sorry, I cannot show you at this moment, but yeah, so particularly, I think this is the kind of ways how we are really trying to providing with some kind of initial understanding about their spatial and temporal variations. So yeah, I'll try to find that, we'll send it to you, but yes, there is some kind of patterns.
Questions, comments, thoughts?
Yes.
You answered one when you talked about the trade-offs of efficiency and equity. That sounds really interesting. But you also study disasters. And
Right.
So if you have Baltimore in here and the Key Bridge going down, you would definitely see a big bump in infrastructure. So
Right.
How would the model account for those one-off events?
Okay, well, that's a great thought. Unfortunately, right now, this model doesn't have the capacity to measure that particular one. I mean, we haven't tried that, but I think that there is the possibility to measure that kind of impacts. So basically, all you have to do is just to add these additional, let's say, if it's significantly large, let's say one-time investment, like, certain amount, right? So we can certainly plug that into the city. What this model definitely will tell you is it will tell you what is the predicted kind of social vulnerability index for that particular city. But also, depending on the funding, where it come from. If this is funding come from, let's say, an earmark that's just coming from nowhere, right? So we can just hypothetically assuming that money just come from somewhere, you do see that kind of changes. But if you wanted to measure, let's say, wait a minute, if these $1 billion is going to be transferred, let's say from DC now to Baltimore, well, I think this models will be able to tell you, well, how this, social vulnerability index of these two cities or maybe more cities will change. So I think short answer is yes, that's definitely a great application of this kind of frameworks, but we haven't, tested anything like that.
All right, well, let's thank our presenter one more time.
Question?